Welcome to Pete's Property Podcast, brought to you by Buyers and hosted by Pete Wargent, buyer's agent, finance and real estate expert, and all-round property guru, plus published author. Join Pete for 30 minutes as he chats all things property with a new guest each week. Learn practical tips from the movers and shakers in the property industry and well-known personalities sharing their property journeys.
G'day, welcome to this week's episode of the Pete Wargent Property Pod. I'm thrilled today to have a very special guest. It's none other than Mr. Chris Bates from Wealthful. Chris, welcome.
Love chatting to you, Pete. Been reading your stuff for a long time. We've been friends for a long time too, so it's good to be on here.
You're a hard man to track down at the moment. I know you've been very busy with business and family and everything else. So it's great to finally track you down and get you on the podcast. So tell us a bit about your background. Where you're from? Where did you grow up? What did your parents do? That kind of thing.
Basically, parents are English, so I've got that English heritage a bit like yourself. But born in Melbourne, grew up in Newcastle, and then when I hit my sort of 18, lived in Sydney, then moved to London, and then Melbourne, and then back to Sydney, and then back to Melbourne, and back to Sydney. So moved around a lot in my 20s, and then but now live up on the northern beaches in Sydney, up near Avalon, and married, got a couple of young kids, which is what you were talking about before, 2 under 2. So send us good wishes, people, and that's probably, hopefully that helps.
And I've seen from some of your online content, you're a Liverpool fan. So my mum's from Liverpool. I've got a theory that you can actually work out how old people are based on whether they support Manchester United or Liverpool. So I've got a ballpark guess from that.
That's right, or City.
Yeah, that's it. So I guess apart from being a football fan, how did you actually get into the idea of finance and then later investing and property?
Look, I think I was, this is not an arrogant way at all. I was always pretty talented with numbers. I was always sort of finding it quite easy. That was my sort of calling, I guess, at school. A lot of other subjects I was nowhere near as good at. And, naturally when you're good at numbers and you're always thinking about numbers, and that's what you usually do, you start thinking, well, maybe I should work in numbers when I'm older, right? There's no one really giving me amazing career advice. Doing little businesses, to be honest, when I was at high school, making a little bit of money. And so what do I do with this money? And I started learning about investing. And then when I got to 18, I became an accountant, did that for a year, then realized in 15 years' time, I'm going to be doing exactly the same as what I'm doing now. That did not excite me. Thought I wanted to go into funds management, worked at Platinum Asset Management, which most people would probably know about. Decided I definitely didn't want to be an investment banker, and then met a financial advisor. Got back into financial advisors at 20 and actually moved to the UK. And that's sort of how it all happened. I think I got just early exposure to around money and thinking about money, and then played games. I played with lots of different direct shares, funds, margin loans, all in my sort of late teens. And so that was early days.
Yeah, I've watched your presentations, and you obviously got an affinity with numbers. And since we first met in Sydney, I've watched with amazement as your online reach, particularly on sites like LinkedIn and so on. You've got tens of thousands of followers. What's the secret to growing your business and your influence in that way? Because I don't think I've seen anybody with as much LinkedIn interaction as you've had, at least until the recent family edition. So what do you do that's different to what everyone else does?
Look, I'd like to say that I have a real clear strategy and I'm formulating it every day and tinkering it. It hasn't been like that. I actually presented on personal brand to buyers agents on the weekend at a big conference. And look, I think all it is me just thinking about my days and the way I'm looking and reading and digesting information and things like your blog and lots of other things, Pete. And just as I'm increasing my learning, I'm sharing it out with an audience. And over time, that's created a bit of a following, I guess. And then that's just created a bit of reach. When things are a bit interesting for people, they share and like and comment. And that's all that's all it is to it. I have no real marketing background or very complex, strategy at all.
Yeah, I guess the other thing, there's you were an early adopter of the podcast format, and very successful podcast, which we can link in the show notes, specifically on property. And you've had some amazing guests on there over the years, and always features highly in the charts. I guess one of the things always taken from your analysis is your confidence with respect to property to look at long-term prices and not get too bogged down in the short-term noise. What about your sort of general philosophy as it relates to property and investing?
Look, I think I've had one of the benefits of what we do. So I've been a financial advisor for a long time, and we sold that business, but now we've sort of grown to one of the biggest brokers out there. We'll probably do up to $300 million of loans this year, and that's a lot of people we're speaking to every day. And I've been talking to people around property for the last almost since 2012. So let's just call it 10 years, right? And so they come to us literally like the call before today, and they're trying to think about what's the next best move. And we look at all the decisions they've made in the past. When did they buy that property? What have they done to it? What's it worth today? What's their investments, et cetera. And so we've seen a lot. So not only do we see the noise, but we also see what happens on the ground by looking at individual clients' portfolios and individual decisions. And the biggest thing with the noise is it always talks about one market. So what's the market going to do if interest rates rise? All the banks are saying 4, 10, 15%. Chris Joyce even come out with that, which I highly respect. Does that mean every property in the country is going to fall like that? No. Does it mean it's going to happen? Probably not, because the banks aren't great at this either. So it's just about sort of not getting wrapped up in the whole market story and then looking at individually. Because the thing with property is you don't buy the market. Like when you're a share investor, you buy an ETF or an index fund or a managed fund, and you cut up the market and you diversify. With properties, you buy one property on one street that appeals to hopefully as many markets as you can. And that market's going to shift over time. It's either going to get not much, a little sanctuary, a little protected species of a suburb, which I obviously love as an investment option, or it's going to change a lot. Lots of new high rises, lots of changes to public transport, all sorts of things. And it's just about thinking through how do cities evolve, graphics, but also, how is it likely the city's going to evolve because of just the way it is, the topography and lots of other things. So hopefully that wraps it up. I'm always thinking about the micro market and the decisions that people are making, and then how does that going to change? The city's going to change over the long term. Look, COVID taught me a really big lesson. I was very much believer in the pressure cooker was going to continue for a long time, but the work from home movement and the ability for remote work, it made all sense. But you had a lot of people in middle management and upper management that thought you weren't working unless you were at the office. I thought that shift would take decades till the new generation came in, and COVID changed that. And so that was an amazing thing that changed. But now that it has changed, you've seen prices of properties adjust to that pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an incredible couple of years, and it'll be interesting to watch how much, if at all, things swing back in the other direction. Yeah. I think the great thing about your podcast is you've had such an array of guests on there, from auctioneers and demographers and people in the real estate industry. And I guess one of the reasons I've enjoyed your content over the years is not only, as you mentioned, you've got a financial planning background. You've also got the mortgage broking string to your bow, but in particular, the granularity. You're not just looking at the market or the macro picture, actually understanding what drives housing prices at the street level and the property level. I guess there's a couple of hot topics that spring to mind that I'd like to ask you about. I guess firstly, I know you've done a bit of stuff with first-time buyers over the years. A big point of debate is whether it's harder for first-time buyers today. And I guess, as you said, I suppose to a certain degree, to the individual, that doesn't matter. Like, I guess what really matters is how do you save that first deposit to get on the ladder. So do you have any tips or advice for first-time buyers?
Look, it's really, really hard, obviously, because, the multiples of properties today and the deposit hurdle as prices rise, it's hard. It would be, firstly, don't be trying to get to a 20% deposit. If you can get to ideally a 10 or a 12% deposit plus stamp duty is a really good option. You know, it's really hard when you're single and you're not in a couple. And so you can't just all of a sudden fabricate a partner, for example. But sometimes it's focusing on just not doing something for yourself today, but knowing that if you do have a partner, you can do things together. And so that's probably the second thing is just know it's much harder for you when you're single and you have to play in certain markets. Don't just buy any property. I think a lot of mistakes, and you can see people, we've had clients come to us who have bought properties in 2015, 2016. Properties people bought apartments in good old Brizzy or Melbourne. So they've just followed what you think you should do and just buy a property to get on the ladder. You might get on the ladder, but that doesn't mean it's going to grow in value, and it just means it's going to be a good financial decision. So once you know you can buy, it's really about focusing on a quality asset and trying to educate yourself. We always try to, for the first property, for first-time buyers, is to try to get something that's really going to grow for you because you want to build that asset base. Income's usually not a problem. And so, and why it might not be your dream home, but it could be a property that you can then step into a bigger property as your life sort of progresses. So focus on growth.
Yes, wise words. Thank you, Chris. So I guess something you alluded to just before there was the point on diversification, right? So as you said, in the share market, you can buy an ETF that maybe owns a few hundred companies and you're sort of automatically diversified. But in property, that doesn't happen. And in fact, to some degree, because of the leverage involved, you very often find that people end up top heavy in real estate, not by design, simply because the purchase price is so much higher for early investors. So I guess the question I have for you on that is, I've been reading a lot of online opinion and news articles and whatnot over a long period of time in Australia, and there's nearly always a narrative about overvaluation, future property crash, shit's going to hit the fan and so on. So I guess there's just a very general question. Do you pay much attention to that? And do you still think it's a good idea to invest heavily in real estate, given that people do end up top heavy?
Well, the people who have are the ones who have done really well over the last few years, right? So the people who upgraded their home, who took on that additional debt and they got themselves into a better asset, they're the houses that really went through the roof. The people that potentially were a little bit top heavy a few years ago, etc. So I do think that, because of leverage, you can get a much bigger market exposure in property than you can in shares. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is, when you buy a quality asset, you should get yourself a quality tenant over time. And, even if you do make a loss, then you've got the tax system rewards property because you can, negative gear it. You could do negative gearing with shares. That's not something that's, a lot of people misunderstand, but you don't get as much market exposure. Most people haven't got the confidence to go and buy $1 million in the stock market and negatively gear it on a single day, but they do that with property. The other thing is you don't pay capital gains tax on property price increase until you sell, right? So if you buy properties, they go up in value, you can pull out that equity and then you can go and buy things like shares, so you generally and this is not financial advice, we sold that business to focus 100% on our mortgage broking. Another reason is a lot of financial advisors were referring to us, so it's just a much cleaner model for our business. But, talking about things that I personally, my opinion is on it is build a property portfolio first, maximize your sort of longer term leverage. As you build equity, then diversify as you get into your sort of your 40s and 50s and start getting access to share portfolios. The biggest thing it frustrates me is when people start building share portfolios, but then they forget that they've got a share portfolio already. They've got a super fund. The super fund is your money and it's in a low tax environment. And sometimes it's best to be focused on building that rather than building a small investment property where you're starting to pay tax and capital gains tax, and think about your super as well.
That's a familiar path for a lot of people who do go into property, is that I guess you start to focus on the income producing assets later in the piece, but actually, I guess creating the wealth and the equity in the first place is the most important thing, because then I guess you've got all the choices in the world as you get towards the end game. Now, Chris, I guess, over my journey at various points in time, on and off, we've had debts against a place of residence. But then I saw one of your presentations some years ago in Sydney, where you talked about debt recycling. And I'm very proud to say these days, as I sit here today, I have $0 of non-tax deductible debt. Every dollar of mortgage debt that I've got is fully tax deductible.
Yeah.
So I guess a really simple concept or idea that people often don't seem to know about is the idea of debt recycling. Can you explain to people what actually is debt recycling and why should people consider it?
I'm not a massive fan of it though, Pete. This is a whether you should do it or not. Well, financial advisor will probably want to shoot me, but the reality is what it is, right? So I just left a client now, and I won't mention any names, but I'll give you some rough numbers, right? So he's got there's sometimes big numbers for people, but this is the type of clients that we work with, I guess. He's got a house worth $3 million. He's got $2 million of debt, and he's got $700,000 in his offset account that he's through an asset sale. So he's got heaps of cash, and he's saying, "Well, I don't want to buy any more property right now, but I do want to start buying some shares." And so he's got two options. He's got, do I use my $700,000 in the offset account, which is what sort of he wants to do, or can he redraw some money on his mortgage because his house is worth $3 million, and he can borrow up to 80% on that, which is $2.4 million. And his debt's only $2 million. And so he could potentially release $400,000 of equity to buy shares rather than using $400,000 of his cash from his offset account. And people say, well, why wouldn't you just use the cash in the offset account? Well, if you use the money in the offset account, that means he's going to start paying more interest on his home loan because it's not in his offset account. So he has this high, and that interest is more expensive than the interest he would pay if he decided to borrow money for an investment using equity, because that interest is tax deductible. So if he borrows money to buy a share portfolio, that cost will be cheaper than if he uses his money in his offset account, which is offsetting non-deductible debt. And so what debt recycling is people using equity in their properties, let's call it, to buy assets, usually shares. As those shares go up in value over time, they sell those shares and then they pay off their non-deductible debt on their home. And then they create more equity, and then they release that, and then they buy more shares, etc. Reason I don't like it, Pete, is look, I think if you're buying good assets, i.e. shares, and then you're paying capital gains tax when you sell those shares to then pay off your home loan when interest rates are so low, I feel like you just missed a trick. What I prefer for people to do is use that equity. If they keep the shares, then those shares keep going. They maybe do the dividend reinvestment. So they just sort of fund the shortfall, which is between the interest cost for this debt. So if you buy $500,000 of shares at say 3%, then you're paying $15,000 a year of interest. But if you've got, and then the dividends, I prefer if you could sort of reinvest them in your shares. I think that's just a really good thing if you can sort of lose that $15,000 a year. But then there's also some tax savings that you'll get back. So that'll sort of fund, and you can even reinvest that. So that's where I prefer using the debt recycling strategy back when I was an advisor, is just sort of build a portfolio and then just let it sit there and let those shares do their thing over 20 or 30 years' time. I think it's very risky trying to play investment markets over short terms, and short-term markets can really teach you a lesson. But that debt recycling strategy backfired because the idea was to take out $500,000 of debt to pay off your home loan. Well, share markets fell 20% over that time frame. You're actually $100,000 underwater. You're not even closer to paying off your home loan. You're actually $100,000 worse off. Whereas if you think longer term, you buy the shares and you keep them, and you pay your home loan off with your savings, and you can always make a decision in the future in 10, 20 years' time to sell those shares.
Do you want to save on buyer's agent fees? You could save thousands with Buyers Buyers. As Australia's most extensive network of buyer's agents, we can lock in highly competitive prices. Plus, our national network of buyer's agents are some of the best in the business. So get the Buyers Buyers advantage and talk to us today. Call 1-800-975-051 or visit buyersbuyers.com.au.
I must confess, I'm not a big fan of borrowing for shares. I used to do it when I was younger, and it's actually interesting to look back. The interest rates we used to pay on margin loans is a bit crazy thinking about it. There's such a big hurdle to try and overcome, but in a big sort of raging bull market up until 2007, everybody was doing it. So
this isn't margin loans though, Pete. This is literally using your equity in your home loan. So your interest rates are very similar to home loan rates.
Yes, for sure.
And no margin calls. So That's the danger with margin loans is markets fall pretty fast. You can get underwater. You got to top it up, and then you don't have the money, and you got to sell, and then you crystallize your loss, etc. So no margin calls and a lower cost of capital if you use equity in a home. You've still got the money because you've still got the money in the offset accounts. Whether you use cash or whether you use debt, if you don't want to have that debt in the future, you can always use that money in the offset account to pay off that debt. It's just the dangerous is when you just keep on taking on more debt to invest, but you've got no buffers and you've got no other cash. That's when, you can get yourself into a bit of a sticky situation where you can't fund the loss on your share portfolio.
Yes, you preempted the end of my margin loan experience, which was some rapid fire SMS messages back in the day saying either sell your shares or top up your account. But I think that's a lesson that a lot of young people have to learn the hard way. As you mentioned, I guess this is one of the things that is quite unique about real estate, and it's that unique triumvirate of lending conditions. You get very low rates, you get very long terms, 25, 30-year mortgages, but actually no margin calls or, the residential property, you don't see the portfolio revalued and loans getting called in. So all we've just given there is really just a flavour of Chris's expertise as it relates to lending. So tell us a bit about what Wealthful does for clients, because as I mentioned, you've grown very quickly over the years. You've got, years of expertise in financing and lending strategies. So give us a bit of a flavour of what you do there.
Look, I think that there's a big hole, I think, for, young couples and families. And that's sort of where we specialise in, just because we're at that stage and that's where we really feel that we can add a lot of value. And, their biggest problem is property, without a doubt. It's buying their first home. It's, upgrading from one property to another. It's doing a renovation. It's, what do I do with these assets that became, before the relationship? And so what we do is guide them on their big property decisions. So it could be people early on, first-time buyers. It could be people doing big upgrades. We had clients on the weekend, trying to do a massive upgrade in a Sydney market. How do we do that, with relocation loans and buying first? It could be people who are in a strong position, like that love their house, don't need to renovate it. They're going to stay there for the next 15, 20 years, but, got heaps of equity and, earning good incomes, and let's build a portfolio out for them. We also have the portfolio investor come to us, usually after they've been around a lot of other companies and been sold a lot of dud properties, and we sort of help them really align where they, how to get a better result. Generally our clients are the higher incomes, because of our average loan is much higher than most brokers as well. They're usually buying, houses in the capital cities. We're doing a lot up in Brisbane, actually, Pete. People moving from Sydney, but my business partner's based up there, but predominantly Sydney and, in Melbourne, because I've spent a bit of time down there as well. So, East Coast.
Yeah, we've seen plenty of investors looking interstate at Southeast Queensland over the past couple of years in particular, and actually quite a few people moving up as well.
Absolutely.
You mentioned earlier on about the sort of regional renaissance and people moving out to the cities. And I guess one of the questions I've been asking a lot of people recently is just on, from a personal standpoint, what your potential end game looks like. Because I guess, as I sort of creep to middle age and beyond, I start thinking, well, the superannuation's not a million miles away now. And then I start thinking, well, where might I end up living and what might I end up doing? Do you have any ideas of, what the end game might look like for you?
For me, I think we're just sort of trying to focus on over the next 15, 20 years. I mean, we took a bit of a lifestyle, not a bit of a tame one, I guess. We just went an hour out of the city up to Avalon, but we were very close to looking at places down Kiama, Gerringong. We looked at some houses down there. And so, so we sort of made that mini lifestyle shift. But yeah, I mean, it's a hard one, right? Like, I think everyone likes different things. We love our travel. And so our end game is going to be someone who's different, who wants a big backyard and a farm, or wants to live in the city and be around the action with their, kids and grandkids potentially. And so it's hard to say. Everyone's end game is a bit different. It's also different lifestyles. Some people I love hiking. It's pretty cheap to hike. $200 every few years to buy a pair of shoes. So, and that's the other thing as well. Your income needs are so different. And that's what was one of the challenges with planning. Everyone just thought that everyone did the same thing and needed the same amount of money, but everyone likes different things. So So long-winded answer to your question there, Pete.
Yeah, I think a lot of people over the past 18 months or so have bought second homes. And I think that's probably becoming increasingly popular as the population gets wealthier and people actually want a bit of everything. You know, they want the lifestyle, they want to be close to the action as well. I used to spend a lot of time down in Gerringong and Kiama about 15 years ago. I expect it's a bit more expensive these days, but it gets a little bit chilly in winter, but it's a beautiful part of the world down there. Now,
second homes are interesting because second homes weren't really a conversation, but they are. The challenges we find with them are similar to holiday homes, is that kids' schooling, if it becomes a problem, you know, you can only use it if you want to be around the kids during the week and you've got to go to certain schools, and you only use your second home on weekends, which is more like a holiday home. I think that the real nice time is when you sort of the kids are out of home, right? And you got your boat hole in the city and you got your coastal home and you sort of flip there and you travel, etc. That real sort of not tied to one space, but kids change thing, I think, Pete, don't they?
Well, yeah. When you mentioned in your bio right back at the beginning, you lived in Sydney, Melbourne, London. You know, if you've got that as part of your personality, which I know I definitely do, it actually makes it pretty hard to plan 20 years out. Now, we did mention earlier on taking a long-term view, but contradictory to that, election year, looks like this time around, Labour Party is going to go in with, making itself a smaller target, I guess, with fewer policies, more controversial policies as they relate to capital gains tax and all the other bits and pieces. Do you have any thoughts on any potential impacts on the housing market?
Look, I actually forget it's the election, isn't it? And, usually every year this time of the property market, what policy, in particular Labor are going to do that could change things. And, if they don't do anything major, negative gearing capital gains tax, it could be a bit of a non-event really around property. I think the hard part is right now is that after strong growth in the markets, the risk of making a bad decision or the chance of making a bad decision or a decision that's not going to make you any money increases, right? Because you're going to pay a lot more. Secondly, there's a headwind, interest rates are rising rather than falling. And so, that's what's been pushing a lot of prices. And so I feel like a lot of areas have been priced on, 2% interest rates. And it's going to be interesting to see how they hold up if rates get to 3% or, 4%, which is going to be probably unlikely, but it's definitely possible. So that's the first thing. I think the other thing is that if rates probably won't rise as fast as people expect. I mean, we went to zero when I was in the UK back in 2008. They're still zero, right? We're talking 14 years later. It's very hard for anyone in the world to increase interest rates. And I think the Australian consumer, if they go fast, will stop spending. And so, I don't think they'll rise as fast as people think. But ultimately, you've got things, that'll be tailwinds in the future. You've got migration picking up, and I think the Australian economy will bounce back, pretty strongly, as you can sort of see. So I think, the regionals, I'm a big fan of the regions. I think the first wave went there straight away in 2020. I think we had another wave last year, because they went to 2020, they went to the regions. 2021 at the start, they went back to the capital cities because return to work was sort of a bit different. And then what they wanted went up on them in the city, even the good apartments. They went back to the regions. And then I think at the start of this year, just because of affordability, and especially in places like Sydney, the regions are one of the only options, especially if you want to get into the housing market. So I think the higher premium end of the regions will continue to do really well because there's such short supply. The best locations in the South Coast or the Central Coast or Sunshine Coast, there's only a few pockets with a small number of properties. And so I'm a big fan of the regions. I think all the A-grade properties will still do really well, even though they've gone up so much, because I still think people will want to buy those homes even at low 3 or 4% interest rates and still very low supply. I'm a bit worried about the B, Cs and Ds. Obviously, I'm always worried about the high-rise developments. I'm a bit concerned about the house on land packages and lots of new, high debt, low deposit places, which are things like, fringes, also where they're going to release a lot more land. Yeah, and just the B, Cs and Ds, the busier roads, the things that people were willing to compromise on in the last couple of years and pay a lot of money for, they're the things that will get hit if rates rise faster than people expect.
Yes, I mean, taking the Sunshine Coast as an example, I guess there's certain pockets like Parisian Beach or parts of Noosa Heads and so on where premium prices will always be commanded. But I do wonder when I see in some of the sort of housing estates and so on, with people paying $2 million for a home,
Absolutely.
Thinking, gee whiz, I know there's low interest rates, but makes you just a bit cautious about some of the exuberance in some of those markets. A lot of us expected there to be an overhang of new homes, but it just doesn't seem to have happened, even without immigration, maybe simply because people have bought second homes and now the borders are reopening anyway. So taking a longer term view, what do you see property doing over, let's say, 10 or 20 years? What do you think the Aussie property market will be like in the future, and how do you think it will perform as an asset class? Obviously, while acknowledging the point that it is a granular market.
Look, I think that a few elements here. Australia's population going to be bigger in 10, 20, 30 years' time? I would say yes. And it's one of our ways that we've grown our economy. Not much per capita, but as an economy, we're growing, right? And I think that that's one of our only tickets, that we're very desirable for the rest of the world. And so I think we will import talent and import money as much as we can. And we'll probably be trying to play catch up over the last, 3-4 years. So I would say that, immigration is probably going to be a lot more. I do believe that NIMBY mentality will probably stay the same. I think that the wealth within those will elect certain, people, and that, rules won't probably change. You have all these little sanctuaries within capital cities, and you'll have areas around train stations and, where it makes sense to do high density. Maybe it'll shift in certain suburbs and things like that, but I'm not sure how much it'll shift. And so I think those little pockets, these little lifestyle areas that offer everything from the city and aren't going to change much, I think the land values in those will become scarce, because some of those pockets will change and have got higher risk of changing than others. Yeah, I think they're the stuff that's a scarce commodity. And property is always based on demand and supply. And that has got the ultimate demand. It's the people who are doing well financially, whether they've got lots of cash or whether they're earning lots of money, they want to buy lifestyle assets, and they want to buy in these pockets, whether it's, along the beaches or whether it's inner ring in little, park suburbs. I think that, every year there'll be a growing cohort of people who are earning more money, as the population grows and more people are working. People who are earning that sort of top 20% income, there's a number of those are growing every year, right? And so income's not split, evenly, wealth's not split evenly. And so we live in a capitalist society. This is not saying I agree with it all, but this is just the way it is. And so that portion of people will keep increasing, and then the things that they want stay the same, if not decrease, the scarcity of those assets. And unfortunately, and property is a lifestyle asset, really. At the end of the day, the reason people pay X amount for a property when they could potentially rent it for a very cheap amount is because they want that lifestyle. They want to secure that lifestyle for their family, and so they can, and obviously the tax system supports that as well, in terms of tax-free on your home. So, yeah, I mean, that's for me, Pete. I do think people got to be really worried about building. I think builders are going to have to up their game dramatically. I think the stuff that we've built over the last 20, 30 years will be nothing compared to the quality of new builds over the next 20 or 30 years. The materials, the technology, the sharing, all these sort of things will get better. And so I'm really worried about the poorer quality stuff that's been built. And yeah, you just got to be really careful. I don't think we're going to have a new formula. I think we're going to build lots of high density, maybe medium density around sort of public transport links, and then greenfield estates. And so if you've got greenfield estates, those buildings, they're not built great, they're built cheap. They're going to age well, and there's going to be lots of farms. So you talk about Sunshine Coast, people paying a lot. Well, they're getting a lot of money because there's no land to buy, because developers have got it and they're not cutting it up yet. And, building costs are high and people are desperate. So,
yeah, gosh, there's not much vacant land available. You can pick up bits and pieces on resorts and things, but lots of competition. And you've just got me thinking about changing tastes and building materials and so on, which I guess that's a whole other topic for another day. I guess, look, Chris, today we've only just had a very small flavour of your property strategy and real estate financing expertise, and it's really on a case-by-case basis that people get the real value add. Yeah. So if people want to know a bit more about Wealthful or your podcast, or where else they can get in contact with you, where should they go for more?
Oh, add us on LinkedIn if you're on there, Chris Bates. If you're not on LinkedIn, then just come to our website, Wealthful. Obviously got the Elephant in the Room property podcast as well if you want to have a listen to Veronica and I on there. But yeah, really appreciate coming on, Pete. I like to talk property, so we could do this all day if you like.
Yeah, that's right. It could be a very long podcast, but yes, but I know you've got fatherhood to get back to, so I won't keep you all day. So, Chris, thanks so much for coming on. Always great to get your insights, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Yeah, one thing we did, and probably from one final point, Pete, is we work a lot with buyer's agents, and we've been a massive fan of buyer's agents for a decade. And not many brokers really work with buyer's agents. It's a frustration of mine. They're only starting to dip their toe in there. A lot of financial advisors don't really know who they are. They get knocked on the door by a developer, et cetera, like that. And so, a big fan of sort of people engaging professionals to buy property, because it's really hard to try to compete with every punter and every buyer's agent out there. You need some expertise and local knowledge. So, I just thought I'd give a plug there for quality buyer's agents.
Yeah, I think that's right, especially if you're not buying in your home patch, right? If you're looking interstate or in another region or other part of Australia, getting some local expertise, always important, not least because different real estate laws around the country still. So, yes, thanks so much, Chris, and we'll chat to you again soon.
Talk soon. Thanks, Pete. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Pete's Property Podcast, powered by Buyers. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as Pete chats all things property with a new guest. And just a reminder that the information provided in this podcast is general advice only and doesn't take into account your personal financial situation or needs. You should always consult a licensed professional to discuss your individual personal circumstances.